Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this Green Alliance roundtable or webinar on what the spending review means for nature and climate. We've got some great speakers. I'll introduce them all in a minute. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box. You can use the chat box, but we won't be monitoring it for questions. And if you want to promote the webinar or comment on it publicly, then if you use hashtag GA event, you can do that on X or Blue Sky, and we'll be doing a running commentary on Blue Sky, not on X. So I think that's all I have to say in introduction. The four speakers we've got are Steve Coulter, Green Alliance's head of economy, who will be followed by Holly Brazier-Tope, our Deputy Director of Politics, then Lydia Collis, Head of Natural Environment, and then Nick Davis, Head of Climate Policy. So if we can start with an overview of the spending review, please, from Steve Coulter.
Thank you very much, Sean, and welcome to the Green Alliance webinar, everyone. I'll make three main points quickly. Firstly, I think the spending review was pretty good news for climate and the environment. Leaks to the press beforehand about our issues were quite alarming. There was talk about a scaling down of the warm homes plan, slashing the transport budget, a potentially very bad settlement for DESNZ, and big cuts to sustainable farming were all being suggested. But in the end, all of these areas were largely preserved, even in the face of big increases in spending on the government's other priorities, especially the NHS and defence. So the warm homes plan survives completely intact. Transport budget got a decent real increase in capital spending, and DESNZ also got a big uplift in capital spending, even if we have some qualms about the fact that a lot of this is going to go on nuclear reactors and carbon capture and storage, of which more later. So overall, public spending is set to grow by about 2.3% annually in real terms over the next 3 years. May not be perfect, but this is a long, long way from austerity. Second thing to say is, this was largely a spending review about investment. So the SR allocated 113 billion of extra investment between departments, which is capital spending, which will be paid for by extra borrowing and some cuts in current or day-to-day spending in some departments. And this increase in capital spending is really important, as the UK has underinvested for decades, which has been a massive drag on growth and also threatens net zero. The investment shortfall compared with our G7 peers has been estimated at around £500 billion since the financial crisis. That's an awful lot of money, explains our crappy infrastructure in many ways. Investment as a share of GDP hit a low of 1.5% in 2013. And this SR raises that to about 2.6% of GDP over the Parliament. Although it largely remains at this level throughout, and we still lag other countries in the amounts that we invest. This is still quite brave, as much of the increase in investment was financed by cuts to current spending, which immediately hits voter-facing public services like the police, whereas investment spending takes a long time to deliver, some of it not until well into the next Parliament. But it was the right thing to do. Previous chancellors have just ducked this trade-off and focused on the sugar rush of immediate current spending. But this chancellor didn't do that, and we'll all be better off in the long run because she decided to prioritise the investment that we really need. Finally, though, a note of caution. The numbers in spending reviews are always projections, not fact, especially after the first year. They can and do change, and they're very dependent on outside circumstances. And I think there are two main risks. Firstly, supply bottlenecks. So after years and years of neglecting our infrastructure, do we actually have the capacity to actually ramp up spending suddenly on, say, home decarbonisation? Do we have the skills to do this? Do we have the supply chains? Can we actually deliver this very welcome spending? Hopefully the infrastructure strategy due this week can set our minds at rest on this, but this is a really, really big challenge. And second, don't forget the economy. The government's still in a really tight economic and financial situation. Growth fell sharply in April, and interest rates are not coming down as fast as we'd hoped. The last budget increased borrowing by about 140 billion over the parliament in an economy with debt already well over 100% of GDP. We also now have two major wars involving large energy producers and a potential tariff war with one of our main trading partners, the US. The government needs the economy to grow to pay for all the welcome extra spending. Things aren't looking particularly good. So the next thing to watch out for will be the economic forecasts from the OBR for the autumn budget. If the OBR says a slowing economy means the government will breach its fiscal rules, then some of these plans may have to be revisited. Let's hope that's not the case. We also have the infrastructure review probably this week to look forward to, which will set out more of the case for long-term infrastructure planning, and the industrial strategy, which will hopefully set out how they plan to revive the supply side of the economy. All of these things will hopefully boost business confidence and get the private sector to invest. So we're not out of the woods yet, but all in all, last week was a pretty good week for the environment and net zero. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Steve. Just on the infrastructure plan and the industrial strategy, did the Chancellor allocate enough money to make those transformational, particularly the industrial strategy, which is long awaited and a lot of store is being set by it?
Yeah, good question, Sean. There wasn't an awful lot in the settlement for the business department on this. I mean, one of the things we're really hoping to see with the industrial strategy is some kind of announcement about energy prices, which are a huge burden on businesses and consumers. So there's something apparently being discussed. There'll be a big announcement on that in the industrial strategy. But it's hard to see how it's going to involve an awful lot of cash unless there's something that we don't yet know about. I think the industrial strategy will be important for other reasons. First, it sets out over a long period of time the sectors of the economy the government wants to encourage. This is really good because business always complains that they just can't plan because policy changes all the time. So by setting out a long-term industrial strategy plan, this will hopefully get over that, and they'll invest in the economy and net zero. We'll also hear some more about the foundational sectors that the government will be prioritising, which is also good news. Sectors like steel, which support other sectors, the car industry, which is, even though it's very important, does not have its own sort of section in the industrial strategy. So we'll hear what the government plans to do to help cars decarbonise. And as I mentioned, also things on power prices. And on the infrastructure strategy, this is an even longer term thing. This is a 10-year plan, which again is really, really helpful when it comes to planning the big investments in infrastructure that we really need, but continually get blown off course about. So yeah, lots to come, and hopefully it's all going to add up for a very good case for a sustainable increase in the net zero economy.
Great, thanks, Steve. So now over to Holly. Holly, obviously net zero has become quite a political touchstone with Reform campaigning hard against it. Kemi Badenoch moving her party away from support for 2050. Steve has said this is a good spending review for the environment. What does it say about the government's wider political priorities at this time?
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, I think obviously it goes without saying I'm here to talk about like the vibes, basically, of the government and the response to it, the reaction that it had across the country, really. And I think that the main thing to say is that the reframing of the entire speech from Rachel Reeves was fascinating. I think a lot of people really weren't expecting it. So early on in the government, Rachel Reeves was very much playing to, the big kind of doom picture of both the global economy, but also the knock-on effects it has on the UK, meaning that we were massively constrained in what we could have government spending on, where, the emphasis constantly on Labour's fiscal rules and what that meant. This felt completely different. And I think the renewal framing that they went for is a sign of understanding and listening to, that we've got a government that is a year in, thinking that actually they need to reframe the way that they are talking about things. And a lot of the kind of renewal, community focused, much more localized way of talking about politics and policies was very reminiscent of the levelling up agenda, which the government wouldn't admit, but they're trying to find their own sort of slant on it because it's what cuts through with the public. People don't understand growth in, as like an ethereal concept. whereas something like renewal and levelling up really resonates with people, and people feel like they can understand what that would mean for their community, for their lives. So I think the shift in tone was very notable. How much of the detail actually really cuts through with the public is a very different thing. So obviously a vast bulk of the spending is NHS funding. Something like that, if you look at any of the polls that have come out since, any of the reactions to the spending review, massively popular. It's a source of national pride. Majority of the public, regardless of party, think that that is a positive thing and much needed. Same with prisons, same with looking after, schools and building infrastructure, hospitals, that kind of thing. I think it is more dubious on our stuff, and I think it's because of what you alluded to about the breakdown in cross-party consensus that we are experiencing over net zero, with net zero being this, kind of general idea, rather than looking at individual policies that relate to climate and environment that obviously we all work on. The experts on the call can obviously talk to the policy detail of it, but with DESNZ, as Steve alluded to, getting a 16% increase in capital spending, that's absolutely massive. Yes, a lot of it is going on nuclear. Yes, there are criticisms from across the sector on what that is being spent on, but we have had some really major wins from that. The Warm Homes Plan being delivered in totality, full 13.2 billion, is a really big win and is something that is popular with the public. People understand what that might mean for them. People understand that, government investment is the only way to help fuel poor households, and that it shouldn't only be left to those that are able to pay. But I think we are running a bit of a risk that it is very much, and it's not only in right-wing media, it is generally that the whole agenda is being very tied to Ed Miliband. And that is not a good thing for us. That is not a good, for the broader agenda, that is not where we need this to be. We need it to be a government, seen to the public as a government investment in the climate and nature agenda in the broadest possible way. And I think that is what this spending review was, genuinely, because it was really positive across transport, investing in public transport, across, all sorts of kind of nature and land use stuff, which Lydia will talk about. On DESNZ more broadly, I think, it shows that kind of Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have listened to what Reform are saying, and they are deciding not to play that game. They are deciding to continue vast investment in our agenda, and deciding to take on, the Conservatives, sadly, the biggest response that they had after, in an email that went out to all of their supporters, was talking about the cost of net zero and it being too big of a risk. That is a very different place to where we were, even just a couple of years ago, with the Conservatives and people on the right being supportive broadly of the environmental agenda. And I think what happens in the next year or so will really shape that. And I think something that has also come from this, which I don't think we touched on, was that a lot of this spending is basically there's broad agreement that this spending is going to have to be funded by tax rises in the autumn because of the general fiscal environment and the things that she's committing to. And I think if the argument continues to be made that it is net zero that is pushing up those costs and means that people are paying more in taxes, we are in a really dangerous space. So I think the comms around this are increasingly important, and the way that both government but also civil society and businesses talk about it is only getting more important.
Polly, just on the politics and the cross-party, I received that fundraising email from Mel Stride, the Shadow Chancellor, saying they're spending untold billions on impossible net zero targets. But actually, the money in the DESNZ settlement is going to complete projects started by the last government: nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and warm homes. Do you think that takes the sting out of it? They can hardly say they're all mad policies. They're all Conservative policies, aren't they?
They are, but they are still trying. And they are, I think that the threat of reform and the fact that, you saw Richard Tice's article over the weekend about the fact that he believes and Reform believe that, one, they will leave the Paris Climate Agreement, but two, that Labour are going to, kind of revoke their position on net zero and bring back a lot of the funding before we reach the end of this parliament if they can't get energy bills under control, because they think that there will be such a big public backlash. And I think that is just a symbol of how much that message is cutting through, because the public don't necessarily, like, I think Reform are playing a very smart political game, and it's one that is really cutting through to the public, and that is a dangerous game. And basically the Conservatives feel the pressure of that and feel as though they are vying for the same votes, and are therefore very much playing the tune of that and playing to that agenda. They are very careful to say that they are not anti climate change, very much not, but they are saying that the costs of net zero and the framing of net zero more broadly is the dangerous thing. And I think the fact that there isn't really a robust rebuttal to that yet is a dangerous political place for us to be. But obviously, there is so much of the government's agenda was actually started by the Conservatives, as you say. And I think where we need them to be is to be really proud of a lot of the things that they achieved, because there is so much that is being built on that wouldn't have been possible without the last government, and things that they did, particularly in the nature space. There are so many things that we are just needing to push on and make further, that were originated by a Conservative government, and what we need is for them to come back to their roots. So there are increasingly a small number of voices that will be more and more important within the Conservative Party for that to win out.
Thanks, Holly, and I'm sure we'll come back to energy prices and the relationship or non-relationship with net zero. Just a reminder to put any question and answers in the Q&A box, and also to uptick, if that's the term, those you particularly want answered. And if you want to go on Blue Sky or X, then please use the hashtag GA event. So next, Lydia Collis, Head of Rural Policy. And Lydia, I noticed quite a lot on social media after the spending review saying that this was terrible for nature, terrible for farmers. It was a real slashing of the budget and so on. I wonder if you could just sort of set us right on the facts of what was announced.
Sure. So the biggest bit of the DEFRA budget that there was a lot of attention around was the budget for the farming and countryside programme in England. And that was one of our big priorities going into the spending review. We ideally wanted to see it increased, but we knew that given the atmosphere around this spending review, maintaining that budget would be a good outcome. It has been pretty much maintained at an average of 2.3 billion a year over the next 4 years. That's slightly lower than the 2.4 billion that it was this year. And so some of that tension has come from is 2.3 billion a cut against 2.4. DEFRA have just put a blog up literally in the last half an hour that details the year by year spending, and over the next 3 years the budget is going to go from about 2.33 billion to 2.27 billion over the 3 years after this one. So it is slightly changing, slightly reducing by a few hundred million each year. Even though, and you know, that's not inflation adjusted, so it is going to go less far in those future years than in this one. But we were quite pleased with that outcome, and it has been broadly welcomed across environments and farming groups, at least in the initial reactions on the day. On top of that 2.3 billion a year on average, there's 400 million, which we think is mainly capital for peat and trees and additional nature schemes. It seems to be pretty much a continuation of the Nature for Climate Fund, which has run for several years now and provides funding to support farmers to restore peatlands and plant trees, which improve water quality, improve air quality, block carbon into the soil. Just reading that blog, there was mention of a biodiversity targets programme, which I think is a new scheme that is also getting some of that 400 million, though it was also listed as 450 million on that blog. So not quite sure what exactly the breakdown is there, but that looks like a potentially new scheme that we don't know what it will do yet. But I suppose the reason why we were broadly pleased with this budget particularly is that it really completes the post-Brexit transition that has been underway for farming policy since 2021. So the old style basic payment scheme, which paid an amount of money per hectare, regardless of how sustainably that was managed, that scheme has been is gradually being phased out between 2021 and 2028. And that spend instead is going under the environmental land management schemes that support farming to be more sustainable, support farmers to reduce emissions, recover nature, improve air and water quality. And this spending review, although it didn't change, that transition was already well underway, but what it did do was commit that by the end of this Parliament, 2 billion of that 2.3 billion will be spent through the environmental land management scheme. And that is really significant. That spend was only about 800 million in 2023 and about 300 million in 2021. I've also seen commentary criticising sort of that framing, because it's not that this is new money, it's a redeployment of the money that used to be paid not supporting activities that make our food supply more sustainable, more resilient. And so there are questions about whether this is enough, and there's a growing need to bring private finance in to make sure that it is enough. And we saw government last week put out a call for evidence on how to bring private finance into nature recovery. So yeah, that's why it's a bit of a complicated picture in terms of how much different people have really welcomed this agreement. But in terms of picking up Conservative policies and really running with them, I think that's this is a really positive moment. And I remember before the election, when Keir Starmer was giving the speech at the 2023 National Farmers Union conference, there was a bit of a scramble to try and make sure that he committed to that transition, because we didn't know what they were going to do. We hadn't heard them say that they would do that. So yeah, over the last couple of years, they've really got stuck in to commit to that agenda. In terms of the broader DEFRA budget, I think they did about the fourth worst out of all government departments, with a 2.7% shrinking of the budget over the full spending review period. There's lots of detail that we don't know. We do know that there was a bit of a boost to the flooding budget, which is important for protecting people from the extreme weather events that climate change is already bringing. Beyond that, there's not that much detail, other than there's bits of funding to address historic legacy IT challenges and transform digital services and integrate AI into some of the monitoring that DEFRA does, which I'm sure is all absolutely essential things to be doing. So yeah, there's still more detail to come in terms of exactly how the settlement will be allocated, but I think the headline from us was that it's not as bad as it was feared that it might be.
Great, thanks, Lydia. And within a relatively good settlement, certainly better than expected, on floods and environmental land management. Within that, was there any indication from the spending review about, on floods, for instance, whether it would be natural flood management or hard infrastructure? On the ELM, whether it's largely for the lower tier, or whether more money is going to go to things which give bigger impact for nature? Do we know that, or is that all to play for?
No, there wasn't detail on either of those two things. On the farming side, those just are big questions that we really want to see engagement with in terms of looking at where are we trying to get to and how do we need to spend the money to get there. Green Alliance wants to see a increased budget for the higher tier and landscape recovery schemes, which are particularly important for supporting farmers in upland areas where food production is generally less profitable and where there's potential to deliver huge gains for climate and nature. I think that the settlement is as it is does mean that there is space to grow all three schemes. So hopefully we're not going to be in a situation where there's any conversation about not expanding any of them, but we would like to see a sharpened sustainable farming incentive scheme, which is at the least ambitious end of the spectrum, and relatively less growth in that, because it's so much bigger at this point than the other two schemes, where we think there needs to be a lot of growth in order to get on track in delivering on those environmental targets, but also in supporting farms in the areas where it's most difficult to make a profit just producing food alone.
Great, thanks, Lydia. And there are a couple of the blog the DEFRA blog that Lydia mentioned. There's a link to that in the chat, and also a link to Green Alliance's full briefing on the spending review. So the last speaker, Nick Davis, head of climate policy at Green Alliance. Nick, I think you're going to mop up everything else, particularly with energy and transport.
Thanks, Sean. Well, the spending reviews delivered a broadly positive outcome for climate action, directing significant capital investment into reducing our reliance on fossil fuels to heat our homes, fuel our vehicles, and power our economy, even in a tight fiscal environment. We'd feared that investment in energy bill cutting, warm homes, upgrades, and better public transport were to be scaled back, as Steve mentioned, but they appear to have survived more or less intact, with the Chancellor delivering an increase in capital investment at both the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero and the Department for Transport. However, both departments do face a reduction in their day-to-day spending. Transport's the highest emitting sector, so it was welcome that capital investment there is increasing at a rate of 3.9% a year in real terms, with a significant focus on improving public transport across our underfunded regions. However, the overall transport budget still faces a real terms cut. There will be a 5% reduction in day-to-day transport spending, which could spell rail fare increases and further cuts to already decimated rural bus services. Better news though is 10.2 billion will be going into improving our rail network, with a focus on regional connectivity, including projects like the Transpennine route upgrade that will reduce journey times between Manchester and Leeds. 15.6 billion is going to elected mayors in 9 city regions as part of the new streamlined multi-year integrated settlements for mayoral authorities, which will enable them to deliver tram, rail and bus improvement projects like the West Yorkshire mass transit scheme that's going to connect communities in Leeds and Bradford with a new tram system. Chancellor's also pledged 2.6 billion over 4 years to decarbonise transport, so putting money into the electrification of cars, vans and heavy goods vehicles, which is essential, but government's halved the annual investment in the rollout of electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which is very disappointing. That's a vital bit of kit that we need to give drivers the confidence to make that switch. And also there's 24 billion earmarked for roads, although local roads have been included in the budget this time rather than just the strategic road network. Hopefully that signals a small reduction in the amount of money going to road building, but there may be some road building projects there. We would prefer that money to be spent on maintenance as far as possible of roads. In recognition of the priority given to the clean energy mission by the government, the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero has received one of the biggest boosts in capital investment of any department. When you take into account the uplift seen in the first phase of the spending review, DESNZ sees a 16% annual average real terms increase in its capital budget over both phases of the spending review. However, like transport, it's also seeing a reduction in its day-to-day spending. The government sees nuclear as an essential element in its clean energy mission, and 14.2 billion pounds is being invested over the spending review to build Sizewell C. That's going to be the first state-backed nuclear power station in terms of primarily state-funded since the 1980s, hopefully providing a better deal for the taxpayer than funding state-backed companies from other countries to build it like we have done in Hinkley. 9.4 billion pounds of capital investment is going to support the first 2 carbon capture, usage and storage clusters. The Chancellor's effectively cut the budget for Ed Miliband's Great British Energy Company by splitting the 8.3 billion that was promised to capitalise that with Great British Energy Nuclear. And interestingly, GBE was originally branded as a publicly owned energy company, but we are now seeing that it's actually it's going to operate more like a green investment bank. Probably the highlight for us was that the government says it's fulfilling its manifesto commitment to fund the Warm Homes Plan with £13.2 billion. That's roughly double what the previous government was committed to spending on home upgrades. However, it did say that it was going to be spending 5 billion of this through what's called financial transactions. This is in line with changes announced in the autumn budget, a new focus of the fiscal rules on public sector net financial liabilities. And that means that, that money will be delivered as loans and maybe equity investments rather than grant payments, with delivery supported by the National Wealth Fund. We think that needs some further scrutiny, but hopefully there is potential there to deliver the upgrade in home energy efficiency and heat pump installations that we need. So overall, the spending review settlement falls short of the transformative scale of investment originally promised by Labour's Green Prosperity Plan, announced by Rachel Reeves when Labour was in opposition and interest rates were much lower. But it does deliver still significant capital investment to deliver the government's clean energy mission and accelerate to net zero in both transport and buildings.
Thanks, Nick. And we know from work Green Alliance has done, our net zero policy tracker, that the two major things the government needs to do to get on track to net zero are speedy rollout of heat pumps and speedy rollout of electric vehicles. So I guess on electric vehicles, the budget for charging points to support local authority charging points has been halved. I think there's something like £13 billion for the I forget the figure. There's a £24 billion earmarked for roads, and I think a £400 million cut to the EV charging budget. I wonder what impact that will have on meeting net zero targets. And the other question, I guess, is whether within the 13.2 billion there's a real push to get heat pumps out and to get them more popular and to try and counter some of the disinformation about heat pumps, which after all are sort of totally standard in very cold countries like Norway.
Yeah, so it's really disappointing actually to see the government halve the amount of money that's going into charging infrastructure in the UK. And this comes on the back of the government actually weakening its flagship policy to drive the sale of electric vehicles, the zero emission vehicle mandate. And that's the single biggest carbon cutting policy that the government has, because road transport, and particularly cars and vans, the highest emitting single source of emissions in the UK. On the back of weakening that policy, we were calling for the government to actually maintain demand for EVs by putting more money into infrastructure investment, using the industrial strategy to support the transition for car manufacturers to producing EVs, and to boost consumer demand to keep the impressive growth that we've seen in electric vehicles going. So yeah, very disappointed to see that budget cut, and that's particularly a problem because there's still big regional disparities in charging infrastructure. There's actually more charge points in the London borough of Westminster than there are in all of Greater Manchester and Merseyside. So huge job still to be done in rolling out charging infrastructure. So that's disappointment. On the heat pumps, there is some good news. The full 13.2 billion is being used, and the government's also said that it's going to increase the amount of money that's going into the boiler upgrade scheme every year. That scheme's currently boosting the demand for heat pumps. We're still a long way short of where we need to be to fulfill the government's ambition to be installing 600,000 by 2028. We're only at a tenth of that rate at the moment, but we did see record growth last year. We've seen the latest monthly figures on that show that there is considerable growth. So it's positive that the government's increasing the budget, and it's going to do it on a yearly basis. And also the government's consulting at the moment to widen the potential eligibility for technologies and the ownership models that could be used. So air source heat pumps and heat batteries might be included in that scheme, and also there might be different ownership models, so loan models and potentially models where people pay part of the cost going forward over a monthly basis rather than in one big lump sum. And that's where maybe the financial transactions that the government's announced maybe could help with that. So I think good news on heat pumps, a bit disappointing on the EV transition.
Thanks, Nick. Well, we'll go to questions that have been put in the Q&A. Just a reminder, if you put questions in the Q&A, we'll see them and you can upvote them. Please don't put them in the chat. I just wanted to raise one thing before we do that with Steve, that Nick mentioned the original hopes of the government's sort of investment plan. In opposition, Labour was talking about huge investment along the lines of Joe Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. And there's been disappointment about the lack of investment in net zero and the lack of kind of seeing net zero as a key economic tool. I noticed that on LinkedIn, Dimitris Angelis, who's been consistently calling for an increase in investment, and he said real progress at last. Do you, Steve, regard this as a sort of a bit of a turning of the corner now that net zero is back as a sort of central economic part of Labour's economic strategy alongside other investment?
Yeah, to an extent. We were obviously all very disappointed when the 28 billion a year green prosperity plan was sort of sidelined. And then we had about a year when really all the narrative was on growth, and net zero was seen as sort of somehow rather unhelpful for that. And now I think those two narratives are back together and going in a sensible direction, that actually the government still obviously needs growth, probably even more now, because the growth it expected in the first year of its administration has not appeared, so it needs it even more than it did in the past. Now I think it's also helpfully coming back to the idea that actually net zero does actually offer a lot of opportunities. We'll see much more of this in the industrial strategy later this month. But I think they clearly have come to their senses in a way and realize that actually investing in these industries is actually really going to help their central growth mission. And the other thing which I just can't emphasize enough is the focus on investment, which is really quite new. Most governments over the last 15 years, whenever there's been a crisis in the public finances caused by a lack of growth or a crisis or something, what do they cut? Not day-to-day spending, but investment spending, which is why it fell to about 1.5% under George Osborne. And this just absolutely cripples the economy. It's terrible for productivity. Our productivity growth is absolutely lousy. It's the reason we've not really grown. It's the reason no one's really had a pay rise in the last 15 years once you strip out things like inflation and the rising population. So I think they're realizing that the fundamentals of the green economy are actually intrinsic to what they want to do on decarbonisation, and actually offer a way out of this sort of low growth, low spending public finances torpor that they found themselves in over the last year or so. So it could all still go horribly wrong, as I said, but the signs are, I think their minds are in the right place on this, and it's quite close to what we've been calling for.
Stephen, as we know, the green economy is growing much faster than the economy as a whole. So hopefully that message also has got through. Let's go to some of the questions in the Q&A, and the most upvoted question, and this is probably one for you, Nick, though, or possibly Holly, is why is the government so shiny-eyed about CCS when the track record is so poor, it's carbon capture and storage, and nuclear when the track record is so expensive? Perhaps we get a political answer first, Holly.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really difficult one, and I think part of it is obviously they are under extreme pressure from businesses, and they are having to deal with the reality of governing and they are being told that they need to invest in all sorts of things. And I think CCS, and I mean, obviously, yeah, nuclear is eye-wateringly expensive, but actually, when you look at public opinion, it is one of the things, particularly on SMRs, so small modular reactors, that polls incredibly well with the public. People actually really do believe in nuclear, although I did see some interesting analysis that says that tends to be men more than women, and women are a lot more sceptical of nuclear. And I think on CCS, I mean, the government obviously have an ongoing review into greenhouse gas removals more broadly, which I think is broadly about biomass, but it is also very much about CCS. And I think part of the problem that they see is that you have to invest in possible technologies because you can't be, rejecting it outright. It does have a poor record, but there are things in the past that, have had very slow starts and poor records for a while that then suddenly do come through. And I think the government probably just feel like they need to hedge their bets and they need to do an element of state investment for businesses to continue investing.
Holly and Nick, just on carbon capture. I mean, we will need carbon capture, won't we? The net bit of net zero, we do need to capture carbon in some way. And presumably the government is also influenced by the fact that a lot of the jobs around the CCS clusters are in areas of deindustrialization, red wall areas, etc.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Nearly all pathways to net zero will require some form of carbon storage and eventually net negative emissions, so removing carbon from the atmosphere. So actually, carbon capture, usage and storage is pretty essential for that. And as you said, it's really key in industrial decarbonisation in some sectors. There's some sectors such as cement production where CCS is absolutely vital to provide a way to zero emission production. And the government also sees it as essential for low carbon hydrogen production as well. I mean, I think it remains to be seen whether the government's actually going to achieve its original aim, though, to capture and store 20 to 30 million tons of carbon equivalent per year by 2030, which is quite a significant amount. And we're only seeing these clusters get up and running now. Many of the existing CCS schemes around the world, they've been designed to maximize oil recovery from old wells, and they haven't always captured as much carbon as hoped. I think this has been recognised in Parliament. The Public Accounts Committee has warned recently that investing public funds in a relatively underdeveloped technology like CCS was quite a high-risk approach to decarbonisation. I think we would urge government to move to a funding model that is based more on the polluter pays, so being driven by the industries paying rather than being supported so much through public subsidy.
I don't know if anybody else wants to add. I mean, Steve, CCS is also seen as a potential growth area for the UK or export area. Is that motivating government?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I think it's the government's been quite heavily lobbied on CCS. So you always got to remember, is the government sort of taking certain spending decisions for sort of rational economic reasons, or is it just being heavily lobbied by certain industries? And I think that may be the latter. When it comes to choosing which sectors to support, there are always opportunity costs in industrial strategy. If you back industry A, it means you're not backing industry B. So I think our argument is that, as Nick says, that there's a role for CCS, and it may help certain industries like cement to decarbonize. But if you're just looking at what's the absolute best way of spending public money to grow the economy, I don't think you'd necessarily choose CCS. There are lots of other areas that you probably prioritize first. So I think the difference is that the industry is probably lobbying quite heavily on this, and the government's fairly susceptible because obviously the losses from certain industry that are now moving into depending on CCS will be quite concentrated, and backbenchers may get a bit frisky if they don't feel the economic interests of their constituents are being taken into account.
Thanks, Steve. So there's a question from Sue James that I think the panel will just have violent agreement with it. When they talk, they say net zero is too expensive, what about the much greater costs over time of not investing in net zero? But I think probably everybody on the call will agree with that. Unless anybody wants to comment, I'll go to a question for Lydia from Jonathan Fisher. What are the implications of cuts in DEFRA's running costs on the ability of the Environment Agency to service integrated water management being proposed by the Cunliffe Commission? And I guess more generally, the cuts, the implications of the cuts for arm's length bodies, Natural England, as well as the Environment Agency.
Yeah, thank you. Just on the previous question, in terms of the costs of not getting to net zero, I do think that we could do more to bring out at times how much people are already paying for the impacts of climate change and nature degradation. We did some work earlier this year. My colleague Matilda Dunn looked at how much people are paying through 3 household bills, so through their annual food bill, their home insurance, which picks up flood risk, and through water bills, and found that people are already paying just through those 3 bills more than £200 a year because of the impacts of climate change and nature degradation. So there are real costs that people are already paying from not dealing with these problems. I think because lots of it is about avoiding cost, it sort of doesn't play into the Treasury economics that well in terms of when you're trying to make a really clear case about it, because a lot of avoiding the worst effects about climate change is avoiding a percentage risk that some really bad event might happen. But yeah, obviously there is a very compelling case to be made. On the other question, I mean some of exactly what those arm's length bodies budgets are just hasn't been worked through yet. Though yeah, there are going to be cuts presumably, because that's generally what's happened in the broader budget. I think some of what's coming through those reviews, like the Cunliffe review, is an approach that is trying to be more streamlined. And I know that Natural England, for example, are refreshing their strategy and are trying to look at how do they put more resource into detection in really high risk important areas. So there's obviously strategy underway to try and like see how you use the resource that you've got the best. There's also, I've lost track of which reviews have been launched, but there's also now something on farming regulations that is just being launched as well. So there's sort of so many moving parts in that space, and not massively on top of all of it. Although there are things like that trial of looking at giving trusted ENGOs and the like more ability to change things without sort of needing to be under so much scrutiny. So yeah, I think that's where things are in that space, is sort of given the cuts, how do those arm's length bodies do as best a job they can as possible in trying to improve the water environment, the air environment, etc.
Great, Lydia. We'll put a link to that report, Matilda's report, in the chat. About 10 minutes. I'll rattle through some questions now. One, I think, for Holly from Charlotte Ravenscroft from Lucent. Was there anything that we can learn from the run-up to this spending review about what led to successful outcomes in some of these areas, e.g. the warm homes spend being retained? How any insights on the lobbying?
Yeah, I think it was a particularly interesting one because I mean, on the 2 key areas for us, which were the warm homes plan and the retaining of the farming budget, there were massive campaigns across civil society mostly, but also where there were conjunctions with other sectors and people, which I do think played a role. We were kind of in constant contact with advisors and people that wanted, external pressure, particularly on the warm home stuff. So there was a real collaboration of efforts between NGOs, and on the farming stuff, it was between, Green Alliance, worked with the NFU, and other sort of more unlikely actors to really put pressure on and try and encourage particularly backbench pressure I think that worked to quite limited effect in terms of backbenchers, because they are still at a point less than a year in that they want to be incredibly supportive of government regardless of what is happening, even if privately they feel very strongly about issues. So I think it probably was partly because of those lobbying efforts, which were fairly monumental, and you can only pick a couple of them to have any effect. You need to have lots of people aligned. But I think the other part of it was purely that, a lot of our stuff is some of the only growth mission and agenda that the government have. And I think Ed Miliband and team made that case very strongly on the warm home stuff. And I think that there is a reason the DEFRA budget has been reshaped as it is. And I think that is partly because of external pressure, but I do think it is also because we present some of the most positive visions for what the economy could look like, and that this is a real opportunity rather than a cost. And I think that conversation is ongoing, but has been one within government for now. What we need to do is win that further afield.
Holly, there's one for, I think, for Nick from Cape Wilshaw. Steve mentioned energy prices. Do you think the change might be removing or changing the marginal pricing where the high price of gas sets the price of electricity?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. At the moment, we've got a situation that, gas has been the biggest source of electricity generation on our system, but we are rapidly moving to a situation where we'll have renewables and probably offshore wind eventually being the biggest source of electricity generation on our system. But at the moment, the marginal price of gas sets the price for all of our electricity prices. And we know, of course, since the fossil fuel price shock caused by the invasion of Ukraine, that the gas price went through the roof, and that's been the primary cause of the cost of living crisis that has affected households and communities across the country for the last 3 years. So breaking that link between the marginal price of gas and the prices for the rest of the electricity market is really crucial. So the government really needs to accelerate reform on that. Another option is for levy rebalancing. So at the moment, policy costs are paid out of energy bills, and these are rising because the government's putting more money into clean energy, solar, wind, through the mechanism of contracts for difference. That's contracts on for energy generation assets. That's being paid for by bills. That's going up by 23% over the next few years up until 2030. So two methods there the government could use to reduce bills. When we talk about the Warm Homes Plan, there is one option that the government could use, which is to pay for things like the energy company obligation. It's one of the most effective energy efficiency schemes that we have for upgrading homes. That at the moment is paid for through levies. One option that the government could use is to use the 13.2 billion that it's committed for the Warm Homes Plan to pay that directly and then take that money off levies, which would help to reduce energy bills. And we also need to see those policy costs moved gradually over to gas while protecting the most vulnerable consumers, possibly with something like a social tariff, so that we provide an incentive longer term for people to switch to low carbon electric forms of heating like heat pumps.
Nick, I think we've got time for perhaps two more. One for Steve from Tony Plum. What pushes for revisions in the Treasury Green Book should be sought? And perhaps you could also just add what changes in the Treasury Green Book were actually announced in the spending review, because there was a push to encourage investment outside the southeast, which is what the Treasury usually favours.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. This is one of the things that did allow this extra investment spending on transport. So the Green Book basically sets out sort of how you can, how the Treasury can evaluate the sort of value for money of big spending projects. And at the moment, it sort of prioritizes productivity. And that's sort of often measured through things like sort of wages. Obviously, wages are higher in the southeast of England. So ergo, southeast of England projects often get the nod because there's this assumed contribution to productivity. And what the government's saying with its revision to the Green Book is actually we should look at growth. We should look at the contribution to growth. And there, actually, the big opportunities are outside the southeast of England, because in the north of England, Wales, Scotland, public transport has been underinvested in for so long. The extra spending will make a sort of really big contribution. You have to sort of say these are only sort of putative at the moment. We were chatting to the Treasury about this last week. These are things it wants to do. It's not quite set in stone. I think they were able to say this in the spending review. I think they want to signal to the OBR, look, this extra spending is actually going to be really good for growth. It's not just going to sort of ramp up the economy in the southeast of England. We're spending it on areas of the economy where this will have a really good contribution to growth. And they're hoping the OBR will score this better and not assume it's going to breach its fiscal rules. So it's a really sensible thing to do. We've been calling for it for ages, and they finally done it, and it's made quite a big difference.
Thanks, and really quick answers, I think, from Steve and Nick. There's a couple of questions about funded. Is any funding dedicated for training and job creation in the invested sectors? And also, again, from Kate Wilshaw, a question about the lack of well-trained installers for heat pumps, which is damaging the reputation of the heat pump transition. Steve, you've concentrated on skills. Is there anything specifically on skills and training, or is this stuff which will come through later?
Yeah, there's a bit of extra money for training, not all that much. The real thing they need to sort out is the apprenticeship levy, which is more a matter of design than extra money. Also, the massive underfunding of FE colleges, which deliver most of the training, vocational training for things like heat pump engineers. This is a real problem. It's great sort of saying, yeah, we're going to put all this money for home decarb, and we plan to do all these homes. You actually need people to do this stuff. You need trained people to do this. And at the moment, we don't have the pipeline, and successive attempts to improve this have not really worked so far. So this is a big question mark about whether this can be delivered.
Thanks, Steve. We're coming to the end. We better wrap up now. I'm sorry we haven't had time for everybody's questions. Lots of great questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure what we were able to do about that, but do please keep an eye on future events. And some of the questions will be answered in the briefing that is in the chat. And if you have particular questions about the spending review and transport, we're running another webinar on Thursday with speakers from it's from 12 to 1 on Thursday. Sophie O'Connell from Green Alliance is chairing it, and there are speakers from IPPR North, Campaign for Better Transport, and Sustrans. So that's well worth tuning in for. But I think it only remains for me to say thanks everybody very much indeed for coming and for your questions, and thanks to the panel for their answers, and see you at the next Green Alliance event. Thank you.